The weirwood had been weeping for 3 days. Old Nan noticed it first. She noticed everything, in the way that very old women notice things that younger eyes dismiss as coincidence. The heart tree in Winterfell's Godswood stood at the center of the oldest part of the castle, its bark white as bone, its carved face frozen in that expression halfway between grief and hunger that had unsettled generations of Stark children. It wept red sap, always red. That was the way of weirwoods, the old god's tears running down carved cheeks like a wound that never closed. But for 3 days the sap ran gold. Maester Lewin examined it twice, scraped a sample onto parchment, consulted 6 texts from the Citadel's copied manuscripts he kept in his tower, and arrived at no satisfying conclusion. Robb Stark touched the bark on the second morning and pulled his hand back not from pain, but from something he could not name. A sensation like standing at the edge of a great height, the world suddenly larger than it had any right to be. Even the direwolves would not approach the tree. Gray winds circled the Godswood's entrance and would go no further, amber eyes fixed on the heart tree with an attention that bordered on reverence. On the third night, the wolfswood answered. 2 leagues north of Winterfell's walls, where the ancient trees grew dense enough to swallow daylight even at midday, a light appeared that had nothing to do with fire. It was blue-white and steady. No flicker, no smoke, no heat spreading outward through the frost. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Then it was gone, and in its place stood a man. He was tall, and broad-shouldered with long gray-brown hair and a beard that suggested someone who had stopped maintaining appearances in favor of more important concerns. His clothing was strange, layered fabric in earth tones, a rough woven tunic beneath a heavier robe, a belt with an object attached that was neither sword nor dagger in any configuration a Westerosi armorer would recognize. He stood very still for a long moment, the way experienced fighters stand still, not from shock, but from deliberate assessment. His eyes moved across the wolfswood's darkness with calm, methodical attention. Then he breathed out slowly, and his hand moved to the object at his belt. In the trees above him, 2 Winterfell rangers, who had been tracking something unusual toward the castle's perimeter, exchanged a look across 40 feet of frozen darkness. They had been sworn to House Stark for a combined 30 years. They had seen things in the wolfswood that would curdle Southern blood. Neither of them had seen anything like this. The older one, a weathered man named Harwick, who had survived a wildling raid and a cave bear with equal stubbornness, made the hand signal for hold position and reached slowly for his ranging horn. Qui-Gon Jinn heard the movement before Harwick's fingers touched the horn. "I can hear you," he said in a language neither ranger knew, and then paused and something shifted in his expression. Concentration, and then a subtle reaching out that had no physical component. And he said it again in the common tongue of Westeros, the words arriving not from memory but from somewhere deeper. "I can hear you. I'm not a threat. I'm trying to understand where I am." The Force worked differently here. He had felt it the moment the weirwood portal deposited him into this frozen darkness. The same instant transfer, the same disorientation of arrival, but underneath it something vast and slow and ancient, pressing against his awareness like a tide. Not the Force as he knew it, not the clean current of living energy flowing between organisms in the intricate web of existence. Something older. Something that had been here long before the first civilization had risen, that had watched empires build and burn and build again with the patient indifference of stone. It recognized him. That was the strangest part. Whatever moved through this world's deep places, through the roots of white bark trees and the cold ground beneath snow, it knew what he was. And it had been the one to open the door. The rangers emerged from the tree line, crossbows raised, eyes wide with the particular expression of men maintaining discipline over their instincts through sheer professional pride. "Drop the weapon," Harwick said. Qui-Gon looked down at the lightsaber in his hand. He hadn't remembered drawing it, only that the forest darkness had prompted the reflex. He regarded it for a moment, then clipped it back to his belt with deliberate slowness. The ranger's eyes tracked the movement with the kind of focused attention that meant they would not forget it. "My name is Qui-Gon Jinn," he said. "I am a Jedi Master. I don't expect that to mean anything here." He looked up at the sky through the bare branches. Unfamiliar stars. A moon in the right phase but slightly wrong in its color. A frost in the air that carried a particular quality, deep and structural. I'd like to speak with whoever leads your people. I have questions that need answering, and I suspect your lord does as well. By dawn, he was inside Winterfell's walls. By mid-morning, he was standing in the great hall before Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell, Warden of the North, and the most honorable man in the Seven Kingdoms, which, as Qui-Gon would come to understand, was the most dangerous thing a person could be in this world. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. All men must die, but legends endure. And Ned studied the stranger with the gray eyes and the impossible blade the way he studied everything, completely without performance, giving the subject the full weight of his attention. Robb stood to his father's left, hand near his sword with the instinctive vigilance of a young lord still learning to disguise his wariness as courtesy. Maester Luwin had his stylus out. Theon Greyjoy leaned against a far pillar, with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man calculating personal advantage from a situation he didn't yet understand. "You came through the heart tree," Ned said. It was not a question. "Through something connected to it," Qui-Gon said. "A passage I didn't choose and don't fully understand. The trees in your forest, they're not simply trees. There's something alive in them that extends beyond the physical. A network. A consciousness, possibly. It brought me here deliberately." Luwin's stylus moved rapidly across parchment. Ned was quiet for a long moment. In the godswood outside, the heart tree's sap had returned to red. "The old gods," he said finally, with the careful precision of a man who believed in something he could not prove, "speak rarely and never simply. If they opened a door for you, it was not without reason." He met the stranger's eyes with the directness that was the North's particular currency. "The question is whether the reason serves my family and my people." Qui-Gon felt the force settle around the man, like something ancient recognizing integrity. Whatever this world was, whatever its darkness, this particular man carried something uncorrupted. He did not know yet what that purity would cost him. Ned Stark had seen strange things in his life. He had watched a man's shadow detach itself from his body and walk away at the siege of Storm's End. Or thought he had, exhausted and half-frozen as he was, and had filed it under the category of things a practical man does not repeat in polite company. He had seen the direwolf mother dead in the snow with 6 pups alive beside her, and felt the old god's fingerprints on that coincidence so clearly that he had not hesitated to bring the animals home. He believed in the world's deep strangeness with the quiet conviction of a man who had grown up in the North, where winter was a theology and the forest remembered things civilization had forgotten. But the blade of light was something else. Qui-Gon had ignited it once in the yard at Ned's careful request. Not a demonstration of aggression. Ned had framed the request with a particular northern courtesy that was really just directness wearing manners. But an assessment. A lord's right to understand what he was housing within his walls. The lightsaber's blue-white beam had hummed in the gray morning air of Winterfell's training yard, and every person present had gone very still in the way people go still when they encounter something that rearranges their understanding of what the world contains. Roderick Castle, master-at-arms and a man who had trained fighters for 20 years, walked a slow circle around the blade with the expression of a craftsman examining a rival's work. He asked 3 questions in rapid succession. How was the edge maintained? What was the crossguard's function? Could it be parried with Valyrian steel? And Qui-Gon answered each with patient precision. The third answer, that he did not know what Valyrian steel was and would need to see it, prompted Ned to disappear briefly and return with ice, the Stark ancestral greatsword, its rippled gray blade carrying the particular quality of light that only Valyrian steel possessed. The Force told Qui-Gon something interesting about that sword. A resonance, faint but present. The metal had been made with something beyond ordinary craft. He filed the observation carefully and said nothing about it yet. "It won't rust," Qui-Gon said, answering a question Luwin had not yet finished asking. "It's not a metal. The blade itself is a focused energy construct. What you're seeing is plasma contained within a magnetic field generated by the handle. Lewin stopped writing. Started again. Stopped. Plasma, he repeated, with the tone of a man whose entire academic framework had just been politely informed it was insufficient. Maester Lewin, Ned said without looking away from Qui-Gon, write down what you can and accept what you can't. The same as always. Qui-Gon was beginning to understand how Eddard Stark approached most things. The same as always. A philosophy of consistency applied to inconsistent circumstances. He respected it immediately and completely, in the way the living force made him respect genuine stillness in people. It was rare enough to be significant. The questioning continued through the morning and into the afternoon. So conducted in Ned's solar, with a fire burning against the northern cold, and Robb present throughout, speaking less than his father, but listening with the same quality of attention. Qui-Gon answered honestly. He explained the Force without theological defensiveness. It was a field of energy generated by living things. It connected everything. It could be perceived and worked with by those sensitive to it. He had been sensitive to it since childhood and trained in its use for decades. He explained the Jedi Order with similar plainness. An organization devoted to peace, to service, to the Force's guidance. He explained because Ned would eventually ask, and it was better to volunteer uncomfortable information than have it extracted, that he was dead in his own world. Had been, for some years. That the Force sometimes held on to those it was not finished with. Robb's hand tightened on his sword hilt at that. Ned's expression did not change, which was itself a kind of change. You're telling me, Ned said carefully, that you are a dead man. I exist as what my tradition calls a Force ghost, a consciousness retained within the Force after physical death. Whatever your old God's network did when it opened that passage, it gave me a physical form here. I can feel it. Solid ground, cold air, the weight of this chair. He paused. I don't fully understand the mechanics. The Force rarely explains itself in advance. It rarely does, Ned agreed, with a tone that suggested he was speaking from personal, northern theological experience. What followed was the part that mattered. Ned dismissed Lewin, kept Robb, Surin, and leaned forward with his elbows on the Solar's rough-hewn table with the air of a man setting aside formality because the situation had outgrown it. There's a war coming, he said. 5 men claim the Iron Throne, and 3 of them have armies. My king is dead. My son has declared himself king in the north. A brief pause, the weight of that declaration visible on his face, pride and dread in equal measure. Whatever brought you here, you've arrived in the middle of the worst political crisis in living memory. I need to know your intentions. Qui-Gon felt the Force's current moving through the room, the old familiar sensation of a moment that mattered, a branching point where the choice made would echo forward through time in ways that could not be entirely predicted. He had stood in enough of those moments to recognize them without certainty about which branch led where. I don't have a side in your war, he said. I don't know enough about it to choose wisely, and choosing unwisely would cause harm. What I have is a set of skills and a genuine desire to understand what I've arrived in the middle of. He met Ned's eyes with the directness the North seemed to value. I'd like to learn. I'd like to help, where help is genuinely useful. And I'd like to understand what your old gods thought they were doing when they pulled a dead Jedi through a weirwood. Ned studied him for a long moment with those gray eyes that missed nothing. You're an honest man, he said finally. There was something in his voice that sounded almost like sorrow, as though honesty, here, was a quality he had learned to grieve rather than celebrate. I try to be, Qui-Gon said. Then you should know, Ned said quietly, standing and moving to the window that overlooked the courtyard where his daughters were practicing with blade and needle respectively, that honest men do not last long in the South. I would ask you to remember that before you decide how far your help extends. Outside, Arya Stark was chasing her dancing master across the frozen yard with a practiced sword and an expression of pure, ferocious joy. Qui-Gon watched her for a moment, and the Force moved through the room like a cold wind, finding the gap beneath a door. He thought, this family is going to break my heart. He did not yet know how completely he was right. The Raven left Winterfell on a Tuesday morning, one remarkable among the dozen others that departed the Maester's Tower at dawn, carrying the ordinary business of a great house managing its affairs across a continent. Lewin had written it himself, in the careful neutral language of a man who understood that ravens were intercepted and words chosen poorly became weapons in other people's hands. He described the arrival of an unusual traveler, a man of extraordinary ability, foreign origin, unclear provenance, currently a guest of Lord Stark under Northern Hospitality's protections. He did not mention the Blade of Light. Some things, Lewin had decided, required the ear rather than the eye, the living voice rather than ink on parchment. It didn't matter. Varys had other birds. In King's Landing, in the small hours before the court's machinery ground back into its daily performance of power, or the Master of Whisperers sat in his chambers beneath the Red Keep and read a different account entirely, delivered not by Raven but by a child, barefoot and quick-eyed, who had been present in Winterfell's kitchens when the Rangers brought the stranger in and had listened to everything with the particular attentiveness that Varys cultivated in his informants from their youngest years. The account was fragmentary and imprecise in its details. Children reported in images and impressions rather than strategic analysis, but the images were sufficient. A man who appeared from nowhere, a weapon made of light. Lord Stark spoke with him all day behind closed doors. The dire wolves do not growl at him. Varys sat with this information for a long time, in the way he sat with all genuinely significant intelligence, not processing it toward immediate action, but turning it slowly, examining its edges, considering what it meant for the larger architecture of the realm's future. He had spent 30 years reading Westeros's political weather. He knew the difference between a development that was dangerous and one that was merely unusual. This was both, and the combination required careful thought. By dawn, he had drafted 3 separate responses and burned all of them. Some information was best held close until its full value became apparent. Cersei Lannister received her version of the news 4 days later through a source she believed was loyal to her alone and was in fact loyal to whoever paid most consistently, which at present was Littlefinger. She read the account standing in her chambers with the morning light coming through the narrow window and her golden hair still unbound, and her first response was the one that governed most of her political instincts. Who controls this, and how do I take that control from them? Her second response, following immediately, was the one that governed her survival instincts. If this thing is real and the Starks have it, then Joffrey is already in danger. She sent for her brother before the account was back in its hiding place. Meanwhile, in a very different tower, not the Red Keep's calculated grandeur, but the Vale's skyscraping isolation, a letter arrived at the Eyrie that Lisa Tully-Aaron read 3 times, and then clutched to her chest with an expression that mixed religious wonder with the particular instability that had been her defining characteristic since her husband's murder. She had been receiving Littlefinger's letters with increasing frequency, each one carefully calibrated to her particular vulnerabilities, her grief, her paranoia, her sense of divine significance. This one suggested that the stranger in the north might be connected to a prophecy she had once heard from a woods witch near River Run. Littlefinger had no idea if this was true. He had never let uncertainty interfere with a useful narrative. Qui-Gon knew none of this. That he was sitting in the Wolfswood. He had asked Ned's permission to spend time alone among the trees on his 3rd day in Winterfell, and Ned had granted it with the simple pragmatism of a man who extended trust until given specific reason not to. The Wolfswood in winter was a particular kind of silence, not empty but full, layered with the slow respiration of ancient things, frost crystals on bark that had stood for centuries, the distant percussion of a woodpecker working at something dead and hollow. Qui-Gon sat at the base of a weirwood that was smaller than Winterfell's heart tree, but carried the same quality of deep attention, and he reached outward with the Force the way he had been doing since childhood. What came back was extraordinary. The network was vast. He had known that intellectually from his first night in the Wolfswood, felt its scale the way you feel the size of an ocean standing at its edge. Sitting with it now deliberately, he understood it better. It was not a consciousness in any way that resembled sentient thought. It did not want or plan or speak in language, but it perceived. Through 10,000 trees spread across a continent It perceived everything that moved within its reach, and it had been perceiving for so long that its memory was geological in its depth. He felt the weight of centuries pressing against his awareness when he reached too deep and pulled back carefully. The force here was not separate from this network. It flowed through it. Whatever the old gods were, whatever ancient intelligence or accumulated memory or spiritual residue gave these trees their particular quality. It existed in the same register as the force, close enough that his sensitivity translated across the gap. He was not wielding the force as he knew it. He was reading something that rhymed with it. What he read, sitting in the wolfswood with his eyes closed and the cold settling into his bones, was a world in profound distress. He had encountered suffering before. The force moved through life, and life included pain, loss, fear, the ordinary darkness of mortal existence. He had worked in war zones and refugee camps and political crises across a galaxy. He knew what large-scale suffering felt like through the force's lens. But this was different in its quality. The distress he felt moving through Westeros's living network was not simply the accumulated pain of individuals in conflict. It was structural, ancient, as though suffering here had been woven into the fabric of the world's functioning over so many generations that it had become indistinguishable from the ground itself. And underneath it, colder than the wolfswood's frost, something else entirely. From the north, from beyond a great barrier, he could feel as a wall of old magic in the landscape's bones. Something that was not alive in any sense the force recognized. Not dead either, but suspended between states, massive and patient and profoundly wrong, in the way that only things which should not exist carry wrongness as a fundamental quality. He opened his eyes. Above him, a raven sat on the weirwood branch, looking down with an attention that did not belong to ravens. Its eyes were the ordinary black of its species, and simultaneously something else. He met its gaze for a long moment. "And I felt that too," he said quietly. "Whatever's coming from the north." The raven cocked its head, and the weirwood's bark behind him wept a single slow tear of red sap that caught the winter light like a wound. In King's Landing, Peter Baelish smiled at a letter he had just received and began composing the reply that would, in 3 months' time, place Qui-Gon Jinn in the path of a royal procession and ensure that the most dangerous man in the city would have an opportunity to make his introduction. Chaos, Littlefinger had always believed, was a ladder. He had never met a man who could feel the ladder being built. The road south from Winterfell to King's Landing was 1,000 miles of Westeros's unvarnished reality, and Qui-Gon walked most of it. And he had declined the horse Ned offered with genuine gratitude and accepted it 3 days later, when the King's Road's frozen mud made the math of time unavoidable. He rode without complaint and observed everything with the complete attentiveness that had been his defining quality since his own master had first noted it, decades ago, in a galaxy that no longer contained him in any physical sense. The Force was his methodology of perception, not a supernatural shortcut, but a discipline of presence, a practiced openness to what was actually happening rather than what one expected or feared or hoped to find. What was actually happening on the King's Road in the second year of the War of the Five Kings was this: people were dying in the margins. Not the dramatic deaths of battles and betrayals that would eventually fill the histories maesters wrote for lords who wanted their violence organized into narrative. The small deaths, the structural ones, a village 2 leagues off the road where half the houses stood with caved-in roofs, and the remaining inhabitants had the particular hollow quality in their eyes that came from insufficient food sustained across too many seasons. A column of refugees moving south from a hamlet that had been caught between Lannister foraging parties and Stark outriders, their belongings reduced to what could be carried, their faces wearing the expression of people who had stopped expecting circumstances to improve and were now simply moving because movement was marginally better than stillness. Near children with the distended stillness of hunger that Qui-Gon recognized from a dozen worlds and had never learned to see without feeling it as a physical weight in his chest. The Force asked him to be present with all of it. This was what the living force meant in practice. Not the comfort of abstract philosophy, but the discipline of remaining open to suffering without either collapsing into it or sealing yourself against it with the emotional armor that, in his experience, eventually became indistinguishable from indifference. He stopped at the village and shared what food he carried. He helped dig out a collapsed section of road where a cart had become trapped, not using the force with the casual economy of long practice, and watching the trapped family's faces move through confusion to wonder to a carefully suppressed terror that he recognized as the Westerosi default response to magic. He sat with an old woman near Moat Cailin who was dying of something that had no cure in any medicine he carried, and held her hand while she went, because the force was there too, and it mattered to witness. Each stop cost time. Each was, by the living force's measure, exactly correct. It was at a way station inn 3 days south of the Neck that the philosophy first cracked. The inn was called the Crossroads, a name so apt for what happened there that Qui-Gon later wondered if the Force had arranged the irony deliberately. He arrived at dusk, stabled his horse, and was halfway through a bowl of something that used the word stew charitably when the door opened and 6 men entered, wearing the remnants of Lannister livery over the practical clothing of men who had been living rough for weeks. They were not soldiers anymore in any organized sense. They were what soldiers became when the army's structure dissolved around them, and they still had swords and hunger and the habit of taking what they needed. The innkeeper's wife went still behind the bar in the way that meant she recognized them. The largest of the 6, a man with a broken nose that had healed badly, and the eyes of someone who had stopped caring about consequences somewhere along the previous month's road, scanned the room and found it containing 3 elderly travelers, a merchant and his apprentice, a mother with 2 young children eating in the corner, with the focused desperation of people for whom this meal was the day's significant event, and Qui-Gon. The broken-nosed man's eyes rested on the children for a moment too long. Be present, the living force said, with the particular quality it used when presence was about to cost something. Qui-Gon set down his spoon. What followed was brief and, on his part, entirely non-lethal. He had made that decision before standing up, which was the correct order for such decisions. The force moved through the room's close air like a current, reading 6 men's intentions with the clarity of long practice. 3 were genuinely dangerous and fully committed to what their leader was planning. 2 were uncomfortable in performing compliance. 1 was 17 years old and terrified under his aggressive posture, and would, given any reasonable alternative, choose it immediately. He offered the reasonable alternative first, a Jedi's instinct and also a pragmatic assessment. 6 opponents in a confined space with non-combatants present was a problem most efficiently solved through the path of least violence. You should leave, he said, with the force threading quietly through the words in the way it did when he meant them to land with weight. Find food another way tonight. This road will give you options if you look for them. The broken-nosed man laughed and then stopped laughing when the laugh didn't land. The way laughs usually did, the room's atmosphere remaining somehow unmoved by it. The fight lasted 40 seconds. The 3 dangerous men found their weapons flying from their hands with a force that left their arms numb to the elbow. The broken-nosed leader found himself against the wall with a blade of blue light humming 2 inches from his throat, and in its glow, his face showed the full evolution from aggression through confusion to a fear so complete it had passed through the other side into something almost like clarity. Go, Qui-Gon said. They went. The 17-year-old paused at the door and looked back. Qui-Gon met his eyes and felt the force describing him. Frightened, hungry, uncertain, not yet fixed in the direction his life was threatening to take. He reached into his pack and set a small portion of coin on the nearest table without ceremony. There's a Night's Watch recruiter in the next town south, he said. It's cold work and thankless, but it's a life that means something. The boy looked at the coin for a moment, then took it and left without speaking. The mother in the corner had her arms around both children with the grip of someone who had not exhaled in 2 minutes. Qui-Gon returned to his table, picked up his spoon, and found the stew had gone cold. The Force noted his equanimity with something that felt, if he was being honest with himself, slightly ironic. Because the problem was not the 6 men. He had handled the 6 men. The problem was the structure that had created the 6 men. The war that had dissolved their army, the lords whose strategies had stripped this region of its food supply, the political machinery grinding through Westeros with the indifference of a millstone toward the grain beneath it. The Force had asked him to be present with the dying old woman, and the hungry children and the soldiers become brigands. It had not given him any instruction about what a single Jedi Master was supposed to do about the machinery itself. Trust the living moment, his training said. The Force will provide the next step. He trusted it. He did. But sitting in a cold inn on the King's Road with the sounds of a mother comforting her children and the distant noise of 6 desperate men finding their way back to whatever hunger waited for them, Trust felt, for the first time in a long time, like the luxury of a man who did not have to watch the consequences of patience play out on the faces of the hungry. He finished the cold stew because wasting food on the King's Road in wartime was its own kind of wrong. He paid the innkeeper's wife twice what she asked without discussion and sat by the fire until dawn, with the Force settling around him like a blanket that offered warmth without comfort. The next morning he rode south, and the road gave him 3 more versions of the same lesson before noon. King's Landing smelled like ambition rotting in the heat. Qui-Gon had been in cities built on desperation before, port settlements on the outer rim where 3 factions competed for the same dying resource, trade hubs where the gap between the wealthy district and the hungry one was measured in the length of a single street. He understood the architecture of inequality as a structural phenomenon, the way power concentrated itself and then defended that concentration with increasing brutality as the cost of maintaining it rose. He was not naive about cities. But King's Landing was something refined. The Red Keep rose above the city's sprawl with the particular arrogance of a structure that had been built to be seen from everywhere below it, and the city below it had organized itself in unconscious acknowledgement of that hierarchy. The wealthy districts closest to the hill, the desperation pooling at the city's edges in the stinking warrens of Flea Bottom, where children moved between refuse heaps with the purposeful efficiency of creatures who had adapted completely to their environment. The city's smell was a layered text, wood smoke and hoarse and salt air from the harbor, and underneath all of it, the particular human smell of too many people in too small a space with insufficient sanitation and too little hope. The Force was loud here. Not the vast, slow current of the Wolfswood's ancient network, but a different quality entirely. Dense and close and fractured, 10,000 individual threads of emotion and intention and fear, creating a noise that required deliberate management to navigate without being overwhelmed by it. He had learned this discipline in Coruscant's Senate District, where the political class's appetites created a similar quality of forcey static, and he applied it now, a gentle narrowing of attention, a controlled reduction of permeability, enough to walk through the city without absorbing all of it, while remaining open to the specific threads that mattered. The thread that mattered most at that particular moment was coming from the dungeon. He had not intended to go to the dungeon. When he had arrived at the city gates with Ned Stark's letter of introduction and the careful cover identity of a foreign scholar, Lewin's suggestion, practical and well-constructed, and his plan, such as it was, had been to find lodging, spend several days observing the court's geography before entering it, and approach any formal introduction with the patience that the living Force consistently recommended and that Westeros consistently punished. The dungeon was not part of this plan, but the Force moved where it moved, and what it was pulling him toward was a mind of quite extraordinary quality, sitting in a cell somewhere beneath the city's hill, radiating the particular combination of sardonic resignation and furiously active intelligence that Qui-Gon had encountered perhaps twice in his life, and always found immediately compelling. He found the access point through the most direct method available. He asked someone. The gold cloak he approached was not accustomed to being asked direct questions by foreign travelers, and the question, "I understand there's a Lannister prisoner currently awaiting trial. I'd like to arrange a visit," produced the layered response of a man calculating bribery, threat assessment, and personal risk simultaneously. Qui-Gon let the Force settle the calculation gently. Not a full mind trick. He reserved those for genuine necessity, but the subtle atmospheric adjustment that made difficult requests feel reasonable to their recipient. 20 minutes later, he was in the dungeon. Tyrion Lannister looked up from his corner of the cell with the expression of a man who had received many visitors in this particular location and had stopped expecting any of them to be interesting. The expression shifted within approximately 3 seconds of Qui-Gon entering the torchlit space, Cycling through surprise, assessment, and the rapid calculation that was, Qui-Gon was already understanding the imp's fundamental mode of existing in the world. "You're not a Lannister agent," Tyrion said. "Your boots are wrong for a Stark man, and your face doesn't have the particular quality of someone following orders from a castle in the north. Varys, possibly, but Varys's people don't have that." He gestured vaguely at Qui-Gon's bearing. "Quality of someone who genuinely doesn't understand why everyone's afraid of him." "Who are you?" "Qui-Gon Jinn," he said, sitting on the cell floor with the ease of a man for whom proximity to stone and cold was not a concern. "I arrived in the north 3 weeks ago through means neither of us would find easy to explain. I've been making my way south and learning what I can about the current political situation." Tyrion studied him with those mismatched eyes that missed nothing. "And you came to me because the Force brought me here," Qui-Gon said. "And in my experience, the Force tends to know what it's doing, even when I don't. You're Tyrion Lannister. You're arguably the most intelligent person currently in the city. You're also the only Lannister I've spoken to. And I've heard 3 different versions of why you're in this cell, and they contradict each other in ways that suggest the truth is being managed very carefully." A silence. Then Tyrion laughed. A genuine one, surprised out of him, the kind that bypassed the defensive architecture of wit he wore as armor. "The Force," he repeated. "Interesting. The Red Woman would call that the Lord of Light. The Masters would call it coincidence. I'd call it—" He paused and the humor faded slightly, replaced by something more direct. "Either remarkable perception or a very sophisticated opening to a conversation you want something from." "Both can be true," Qui-Gon said. "What I want is accurate information about the court I'm walking into. What I'm offering is a perspective uncorrupted by 30 years of King's Landing politics. I have no stake in your family's fortunes or your enemy's victories. I don't want the throne or a lordship or Lannister gold. Everyone wants something. I want to understand why a world this full of capable people is tearing itself apart while something genuinely catastrophic approaches from the north. That's not a transaction, it's a question." Tyrion went still in the particular way that very intelligent people go still when something cuts through their defenses to something they actually care about. He had heard the rumors from the Night's Watch. He had read Jon Snow's letters forwarded through Robb Stark's correspondence before the war had severed those channels. He had not known what to do with the information in a court consumed by the succession question and his own survival. "My father," Tyrion said, when after a pause that contained considerable interior weather, "orchestrated the Red Wedding. Not yet. It hasn't happened yet. But it will because Robb Stark broke a vow to House Frey, and my father does not waste useful leverage." He said it flatly without the performance of emotion, the way people state facts that are too large for emotional register. "The Stark army will be destroyed at a feast. Guest right violated. Thousands dead. After which my father will have effectively ended the Northern Rebellion and positioned Joffrey's reign on a foundation of rubble and corpses." A pause. "This is the man you'll meet when you enter the Red Keep. I thought you should have an accurate picture." The torch smoke curled upward in the cell's close air. Somewhere above them, the city moved through its ordinary business of commerce and cruelty. Qui-Gon sat with what Tyrion had just told him, feeling the Force's response to it. A deep, cold certainty, like winter already decided. He had arrived too late to interrupt some things. The architecture of the Red Wedding was already built. He could feel it in the Force's currents, in the settled quality of events already in motion. "Tell me about your father," he said. And Tyrion, who had been waiting his entire life for someone to ask that question without wanting to use the answer as a weapon, told him everything. Littlefinger found Qui-Gon on the 3rd day. This was, by Peter Baelish's standards, an unusually long wait. He prided himself on reaching significant variables before they had time to develop independent momentum. The window between a new piece appearing on the board and that piece understanding the board's geometry was the window in which it could be most efficiently redirected. 3 days suggested the stranger from the north had been harder to locate in King's Landing's geography than anticipated, which itself was interesting information. A man who moved through the city without leaving the usual traces of lodging records, market transactions, and the social residue of someone unfamiliar with local customs, either had exceptional help or exceptional instincts. He extended his hand in the small garden off the Street of Sisters, where Qui-Gon had been sitting for 2 hours watching a fountain that had stopped working sometime in the previous year and had not been repaired, which told him something specific about the city's current priorities. "Lord Baelish," Qui-Gon said without turning around. A pause. Littlefinger recovered from surprises with the speed of long practice. The moment of genuine disconcertion lasting less than a breath before the performance resumed. He sat on the bench beside the stranger with the ease of a man who was comfortable everywhere, and therefore threatening nowhere. "You know who I am. Tyrion described you well." "I imagine he did." The smile was present and entirely uninformative, a diplomatic instrument rather than an expression. "And yet you're still here. Which means either you didn't believe him or you believe in meeting everyone regardless of their reputation. Both suggest a certain confidence. Or a certain curiosity," Qui-Gon said. "In my experience," Littlefinger said pleasantly, "the two are difficult to separate." He studied the stranger's profile with the practiced assessment of a man who had built his entire career on reading people accurately and acting on that reading before they could read him back. What he found was unusual enough to require a second pass. The stranger was not performing anything. There was no social mask, no careful arrangement of expression designed to project a particular impression. He simply sat there, present, inobservant, and entirely unintimidated, in the way that people who have genuinely stopped being afraid of consequences sometimes sat. It was either authentic or the most sophisticated performance Littlefinger had ever encountered, and he found himself uncertain which was itself an unfamiliar sensation. "I'll be direct," Littlefinger said, because directness with people who appeared to value it was its own kind of tactic. "You've arrived at a remarkable moment. 5 claimants to the Iron Throne, each with armies and ambitions and the inevitable coalition of lords whose loyalty shifts with the wind. A man with your particular abilities could be extraordinarily valuable to the right patron. I'm in a position to offer you introduction, protection, resources, and the benefit of 30 years navigating the court's machinery. In exchange for what? Information primarily. Your perspective on the factions, or your presence at certain moments where an unusual variable might shift an outcome in a useful direction." A pause, calibrated. "Nothing that would compromise your principles. I understand you're a man of considerable personal ethics." The Force described Littlefinger to Qui-Gon with the clarity of cold water. Not evil in the operatic sense that made villains easy to dismiss. Something more interesting and more dangerous. A man who had been genuinely wounded once, long ago by a world that rewarded birth and position over merit and feeling, and who had responded by deciding that the world's rules were not moral constraints, but simply the current configuration of power, subject to rearrangement by whoever was most willing to do what others considered unthinkable. He believed in almost nothing except his own ability to maneuver, and he had been right about that ability for long enough that it had become indistinguishable from his identity. He was also, the Force noted, genuinely curious about Qui-Gon in a way that was separate from his tactical assessment. The stranger unsettled something in Peter Baelish's carefully maintained certainty about what people were, and he was drawn toward that unsettlement the way a man who believed himself unreadable was drawn toward anyone who might actually read him. Qui-Gon turned and looked at him directly for the first time. "You love Catelyn Stark," he said, not as an accusation, simply as a fact the Force had given him, clearly and without ambiguity, the moment he made real contact with the man's emotional landscape. The performance cracked. Just for a moment, less than a breath, less than a blink. But the crack was there. And in it, Qui-Gon saw the original wound with the perfect clarity of something the Force wanted him to understand. A boy who had loved completely and been denied by the mathematics of lordship and birthright, who had carried that denial for decades and built an empire of manipulation over the top of it, and who had never, not once, allowed himself to examine what all of it had cost. Littlefinger's recovery was instantaneous and impressive. The smile returned, slightly different now. Less diplomatic instrument, more genuine. and therefore more dangerous. "You're extraordinary," he said softly. "What else do you see?" "That you're going to burn Westeros down," Qui-Gon said, without heat or judgment. The way he named things the Force showed him plainly. Not from malice, from a wound that never healed and a philosophy that grew over it like scar tissue. Chaos is your ladder, you believe, but ladders built on other people's suffering eventually collapse, and the fall from a great height is severe, a silence that had genuine weather in it. "And you think," Littlefinger said very carefully, "that you can offer me something different?" "No," Qui-Gon said. "I think you already know what I'm describing is true. I think you've known it for years and have become extraordinarily skilled at not looking directly at it." He paused. "I'm not going to be your asset, Lord Baelish. Not because I'm above the kind of pragmatism your offer implies, but because alliance with you would require me to participate in the machinery that's grinding those people on the King's Road to nothing. And I'm not willing to do that." "Then you'll find this city very difficult," Littlefinger said. The pleasantness had not left his voice, but something had shifted in its register. Respect, perhaps, the involuntary kind that survived the absence of tactical use. "I expect so," Qui-Gon agreed. Littlefinger stood, straightened his doublet with the habitual precision of a man who managed appearances as seriously as he managed anything else, and looked down at the stranger on the bench with an expression that contained more unguarded complexity than most people saw from him in a year. "For what it's worth," he said, "and I acknowledge it's worth very little coming from me, you should be careful of the Queen. I maneuver for position. Cersei Lannister eliminates threats. Why the distinction matters for your continued existence." He left through the garden's far gate, and Qui-Gon watched him go, and felt the Force's assessment settle around the encounter like dust after a disturbance. He had made an enemy today, or something more complex than an enemy. A man who had been genuinely seen, possibly for the first time in decades, and who would not know whether to be grateful or furious about it, and would likely resolve the uncertainty through action. Littlefinger's actions tended to have large consequences. The Force had told him to have the conversation anyway. He trusted that. He did. But sitting in the garden with the broken fountain and the city's noise pressing in from every direction, he was aware of the specific weight of choosing integrity in a place where integrity was a target painted on your chest. Somewhere above him in the Red Keep, Cersei Lannister was reading a report that described the stranger from the north in more detail than any previous account. Because Littlefinger, whatever else the conversation had been, had walked away knowing considerably more about Qui-Gon's capabilities and philosophical commitments than he had arrived with, and information had only one direction it traveled in King's Landing. The fountain stood empty and dry in the winter air. Qui-Gon sat with the Force and waited for the next step to become clear. Melisandre arrived in King's Landing without announcement. This was itself a statement. The Red Woman did not require the social machinery of advanced ravens and formal introductions that governed every other significant arrival at court. She moved through the world with the absolute conviction of someone who believed their path was laid by a god whose interest in the details of courtly protocol was precisely zero. She came off a ship from Dragonstone on a gray morning, with the harbor's cold wind pulling at her red robes and her copper hair, and the dock workers who saw her pass moved aside with the instinctive deference that people paid to things they could not name but recognized as significant. She had seen him in the flames 6 days ago. Not clearly. The Lord of Light's visions were never a clean transaction, never the simple transfer of information that people imagined when they thought about prophecy. Yet they were impressionistic, symbolic, translated through fire's particular grammar of light and shadow, and the emotional register of the seer. What she had seen was a man whose inner light was unlike anything the flames had shown her before. Not Roller's fire. She would have recognized that immediately. The specific quality of the Lord of Light's chosen burning in their chest like a coal that never cooled. This was something different. Older, possibly. Quieter in its nature, but vast in its depth. The way certain deep waters were quiet not from shallowness, but from mass. The flames had also shown her a weirwood weeping gold. She found him on the 4th day, in a sept near the Street of Steel, where he had gone not from any personal theology, but from the Force's direction toward a conversation with a septon, who had been helping flea bottoms hungry with a consistency that put most of the city's formal charity structures to shame. She waited outside with the patience of a woman accustomed to divine timing, and when he emerged into the gray afternoon light, she was standing in the street with her hands folded and her red eyes reading him with an intensity that would have unsettled most people. Qui-Gon looked at her and felt the Force describe something genuinely complex. She believed. That was the first and most important thing the Force showed him. Absolute structural belief, and the kind that had burned away doubt so completely that the space where doubt had been was now occupied by certainty so dense it had become indistinguishable from the woman herself. She had done terrible things from inside that certainty. She would do more. And woven through all of it, inseparable from the genuine evil her certainty had enabled, was something that was not false. A real connection to something real. A spiritual sensitivity that rhymed with the Force in the same key that the Weirwood network did, tuned to a different frequency, but drawing from the same deep source. She was dangerous and genuine simultaneously, and the combination made her more dangerous than either alone. "You are not of this world," she said without greeting, couched in the direct manner of someone for whom social pleasantries were a language they had never bothered to learn. "No," he agreed. "The Lord of Light sent you." "Something brought me here," he said carefully. "I've been calling it the Force. Whether that and your Lord of Light are the same thing, different things, or different names for a phenomenon neither of us fully understands, I genuinely don't know." Her eyes moved over him with the focused attention of someone reading a text in a language they almost spoke. "The flames showed me your light. I have seen the Lord of Light's fire in many men and women, some worthy, most not. What burns in you is different, steadier, less hungry." A pause. "Azor Ahai reborn was promised to us. The prince who was promised, who would stand against the darkness with a burning sword." "I have a lightsaber," Qui-Gon said, with the patience he applied to theological conversations that were moving toward conclusions he needed to redirect. "It does burn technically, but I'm not your prophesied hero. I'm a Jedi Master who arrived through a Weirwood portal and is still working out what he's supposed to do here." "That is exactly what Azor Ahai would say," Melisandre said, with the unassailable certainty of someone who had decided the evidence fit the conclusion. The conversation moved to a tavern, because King's Landing streets were full of ears, and over the next 2 hours Qui-Gon encountered the specific intellectual challenge that Melisandre represented. A mind that was genuinely sharp, genuinely spiritually perceptive, and absolutely committed to a framework that bent every new piece of evidence toward its predetermined conclusion. She was not stupid. She was the opposite of stupid, which made the conversation considerably harder than stupidity would have. She told him about Stannis, about the shadow child that had killed Renly, about Davos Seaworth's quiet, faithful skepticism and his missing fingers, and his absolute loyalty to a king who burned people for the Lord of Light's favor. She told him about the Battle of Blackwater and what the flames had shown her of its outcome. She spoke about the long night with the urgency of someone who had been warning about it longer than Jon Snow had been alive, and had been dismissed by every lord she'd encountered. On the long night, Qui-Gon listened with complete attention, because this was where Melisandre's certainty intersected with what the Force had shown him in the Wolfswood. That vast cold wrongness from beyond the wall, the thing that existed in the suspended state between life and death, massive and patient. She had been feeling it for years through her flames, and her theology gave it a name and a shape and a narrative. The great other, the darkness against which a ruler's fire was the only defense. He did not know if her cosmology was accurate, but the threat it described was real. He had felt it himself. "Stannis," she said, returning to her central argument with the gravity of orbit, "is the Lord of Light's chosen. He has the blood of the dragon, the legitimate claim, and the will to do what others will not. If you are what the flames say you are, not your place is at his side." "Tell me about the little girl," Qui-Gon said, a silence that had the quality of something stepping on uneven ground. "Shireen," he said, "his daughter. You've seen something in the flames about her." Melisandre's expression did not change, but the Force felt something shift beneath it. Not guilt exactly, but the particular tension of a person who has arrived at a future action in their internal landscape and has not yet found the theological language to make it sit still. The Lord of Light demands sacrifice, she said finally. King's blood. Power proportional to what is asked? No, Qui-Gon said. The word landed in the space between them with the quiet finality of a door being closed. Not angry, not performed, simply absolute, in the way that things the Force made him certain of tended to be absolute. When I won't stand beside a cause that burns children, not for any throne and not for any prophecy, whatever I am to your theology, that line does not move. She looked at him for a long moment with those red eyes that had seen so much fire. You would let the long night win, she said, for the sake of one child. I would find another way, he said. There is always another way. The Force has never required me to kill a child, and I don't intend to begin in a world I've been in for less than 2 months. The silence that followed was the complicated kind. Not empty, but working. Melisandre's framework straining against an immovable object it had not previously encountered. She had outlasted kings and lords and skeptics and enemies. She had not previously encountered someone whose certainty was as deep as hers and pointed in a different direction. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted register. Less proclamation, more conversation. Then what do you propose, she said. And Qui-Gon, who had not yet fully worked out the answer but trusted the Force to provide it as needed, said, tell me everything you know about what's beyond the wall. Not the theology, the facts, what you've seen specifically in the flames. Outside the tavern, King's Landing moved through its ordinary afternoon, indifferent to the conversation happening in its midst about the darkness gathering in the north, while the south consumed itself in politics. A raven from the twins was already in flight. The raven arrived at dawn. Qui-Gon was in the small courtyard of the inn he had been using as lodging. A modest establishment near the Gate of the Gods, whose proprietor had stopped asking questions after the third day, having concluded that the answers would be more troubling than their absence. He had been sitting in meditation since the 3rd hour of the morning, working through the Force's particular quality in this city. The dense, fractured noise of 10,000 lives pressing against his awareness. He had developed a rhythm for it over the past weeks, a daily practice of deliberate opening and deliberate closing, like a lung learning to breathe different air. The raven's arrival he felt before he heard it, a spike in the Force's emotional current from the direction of the Red Keep. Not one person's feeling, but a wave. The particular quality of information spreading through a court's nervous system and producing simultaneous reactions in dozens of people who would each respond to the same news according to their nature. Shock in some, satisfaction in others. The cold architectural pleasure of a plan arriving at its intended conclusion. He found Varys in the small garden near the Sept where they had begun meeting 3 weeks ago, after the Master of Whisperers had made his introduction through the medium of a note delivered by a child who had somehow entered Qui-Gon's locked room without any evidence of how, and left it on his pillow with the cheerful disregard for normal entry methods that suggested Varys's little birds were extensively trained. And their meetings had developed a specific quality: 2 men who valued accurate information over comfortable narrative, comparing what each knew about the board's current geometry with the particular respect of people who recognized genuine intelligence in each other without entirely trusting it. Varys had never asked Qui-Gon to do anything. He had simply talked and listened and allowed the stranger to understand King's Landing's deeper architecture through the accumulated weight of carefully chosen observations. It was, Qui-Gon had come to understand, the most sophisticated form of influence the Spider practiced. Not direction, but education, shaping the students' conclusions by curating what they learned. He recognized the methodology and found it less troubling than Littlefinger's because Varys's goal, whatever its complications, it appeared to be genuinely oriented towards something beyond personal advancement. Not enough to trust completely, enough to continue. This morning, Varys's face, which normally maintained the smooth diplomatic blankness of a man who had learned to perform neutrality as a survival mechanism, showed something that had gotten through the performance. He was standing with a piece of parchment held in both hands, and his eyes were moving across it with the expression of a man reading something he had known was coming and had not fully believed until this moment. Robb Stark is dead, Varys said. Catelyn Stark is dead. The Northern Army is destroyed. Lord Walder Frey hosted them at the Twins under guest right and slaughtered them at the wedding feast. Rose Bolton drove a blade through the young wolf himself. A pause. The Raven reached Cersei an hour ago. She is currently celebrating. Qui-Gon stood very still. The Force moved through him in a way he had no clean language for. Not the ordinary grief of loss, though that was present, but something deeper. The confirmation of something he had felt approaching in the Force's currents for weeks, a structural wrongness that he had known was coming and had not known how to stop. The guest right violation landing in Westeros's moral fabric like a stone through ice. He felt the North's response as a distant tremor through the Weirwood network. Not Bran yet, not the three-eyed Raven's full awareness, but the trees registering the violation the way living things registered trauma. He had liked Robb Stark, had met him only briefly in Winterfell's yard, but had felt in him the Force's clear assessment. A young man of genuine quality, military brilliance undermined by the honor his father had taught him and the heart his father had given him, neither of which Westeros had any use for. He had broken a vow for love. The world had charged him the full price. Tyrion, he said. Still in his cell awaiting trial, Varys said. This news complicates his position. Cersei will use the Northern victory to accelerate proceedings. She wants him dead before any momentum can build around his innocence. And Joffrey? Pleased. In the way that Joffrey is pleased by things, which is to say visibly and without any of the discretion that would make it tolerable. A pause waited with the specific weariness of a man who had served near Joffrey Baratheon for years. He has requested that Robb Stark's head be delivered to King's Landing so that he might present it to Sansa at breakfast. Qui-Gon turned away from the fountain and looked at the Red Keep's towers rising above the city's roofline, with the cold morning light finding no warmth in the stone. The living Force had been asking him to be patient for weeks, to observe, to learn, to trust that the next step would become clear when the time was right. He had trusted it through the King's Road suffering in the infight, and Littlefinger's offer, and Melisandre's prophecy, and 30 days of King's Landing's grinding political machinery. He had sat with the Force's direction toward patience, and accepted it the way he had always accepted difficult instructions from something wiser than his immediate reactions. Now Robb Stark was dead, and Catelyn Stark was dead, and the North was broken, and a boy king was requesting a dead man's head to present to his prisoner at breakfast. And the Force's direction toward patience felt, for the first time in Qui-Gon Jinn's long experience of following it, like something he needed to interrogate rather than simply accept. The girl, he said. Sansa, where is she? Her chambers, under guard that is nominally protective and functionally imprisoning. Varys studied him with those pale eyes that had learned to read people the way other men read text. You're considering something. I'm considering several things, Qui-Gon said. Some of them the Force is endorsing, and some of them it isn't. Which ones is it endorsing? He was quiet for a moment. The Force moved through his awareness with the particular quality it used when clarity was available, but required stillness to access. Not the dramatic certainty of a crisis demanding immediate action, but the quieter certainty of a direction becoming visible through sustained attention. Not the ones that feel most satisfying, he said finally. He could feel Joffrey in the Red Keep above them. The Force's description of him was unambiguous, and had been since the first day, a cruelty so structural it had become architectural. A boy in whom empathy had never properly developed, and who had been given absolute power over human life before his character had any foundation to bear the weight. He could go up there. He had the ability. A blade of light in 30 years of combat experience and the Force's precision, ending Joffrey Baratheon was, in the purely mechanical sense, not a difficult problem. The Force said no with the quiet absoluteness it reserved for genuine prohibitions. Not because Joffrey deserved protection, because Qui-Gon was not an assassin, and because the Force had shown him clearly enough in 30 days of King's Landing that removing one corrupt node from a corrupt system produced another corrupt node from the same system, and the second was often worse. Joffrey's death would come from within the machinery that had created him. that was already in motion in ways the Force let him feel, without showing him the specifics. What the Force endorsed was this: Sansa Stark was alone in a hostile city with no family and no allies. And she was going to be handed her brother's death as a weapon this morning by a boy who enjoyed her pain. "I need access to her chambers," he said. Varys looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a man recalculating. "That," Varys said slowly, "is something I can provide. Though I'll note that extracting a ward of the crown from the Red Keep, without a plan for what comes after, is the kind of action that forecloses a great many options." "I'm not extracting her," Qui-Gon said. "I'm going to sit with her while she receives the worst news of her life, and I'm going to tell her the truth, that she is more capable than this city has allowed her to be, and that the game she's being forced to play has rules she hasn't been taught yet but can learn." He paused, one feeling the Force's response to the plan, not the dramatic endorsement of a destined action, but the quiet rightness of something small and human and genuinely needed. "After that," he said, "we'll see what the Force provides." Varys was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in a voice from which most of the performance had been stripped, "She is very alone." "I know," Qui-Gon said. "Her mother is dead. Her father is dead. Her brother is dead." The spider said it with a flatness that was its own kind of grief. "She has been performing survival in that keep for over a year, with no one to tell her that what she's doing is extraordinary." The Force moved through the morning air between them with the clarity it used for simple truths. "Then someone should tell her," Qui-Gon said. Tywin Lannister received him in the Tower of the Hand on a cold afternoon, 9 days after the Red Wedding's ravens had finished their work on the kingdom's political geography. The meeting was Tywin's invitation, which was itself a form of command. In King's Landing, the distinction between the two was purely theoretical, when the invitation came from the man currently functioning as the realm's actual governing intelligence, regardless of whose name sat on the Iron Throne. Qui-Gon had known the invitation was coming. The Force had indicated it with the settled certainty it used for inevitable convergences, two significant forces in the same space eventually producing contact, the way weather systems produce storms. And he had spent the 9 days since the Red Wedding doing what the Force directed, visiting Sansa each morning through Varys's access, sitting with her grief without trying to manage or accelerate it, teaching her the first principles of reading a room's emotional weather the way the Force had taught him, not as mysticism, but as discipline, the practiced attention to what people revealed when they believed themselves unobserved. She was, as Varys had said, extraordinary. The Force showed him that clearly in their first conversation, and more clearly in each subsequent one. A mind that had been using survival as its only permitted outlet for genuine intelligence. A political instinct sharpened by 18 months of performing helplessness in front of people who wanted her helpless. On a capacity for patience that would have impressed Jedi Masters twice her age. He told her this without flattery, in the direct language the Force made him use for things it wanted people to actually hear. She had looked at him with the particular expression of someone receiving accurate information they had stopped expecting the world to provide. He had also, in those 9 days, made a decision that the Force had not precisely endorsed, but had not prohibited either. A decision that sat in the specific territory between wisdom and necessity that Westeros kept pushing him toward, and that his training had never fully mapped, because his training had been designed for a different world. He was going to tell Tywin Lannister the truth, not as strategy, not as the opening move in a negotiation, simply because the Force had brought him to this moment in this city, in this aftermath. And the only thing he had to offer a world this deeply committed to its own destruction was the perspective of someone who stood entirely outside its machinery and could therefore see its shape. The Tower of the Hand's upper chamber was austere in the way that genuine power was often austere. No performance of wealth, no decorative excess, the furniture chosen for function rather than display. Maps covered 2 full walls, covered in notations in a precise hand. The fire burned efficiently in the hearth without the theatrical grandeur Cersei's chambers favored. Tywin Lannister stood at the window overlooking the city with his back to the door when Qui-Gon entered, and did not turn immediately, which was its own statement. A man comfortable enough in his authority that he could afford the performance of indifference to another person's entrance. When he turned, Qui-Gon met the most formidable human intelligence he had yet encountered in Westeros, and felt the Force describe it with the precision of a blade finding its edge. Tywin was not cruel in the way Joffrey was cruel, the reflexive sadism of a child with power and no empathy. His cruelty was architectural. It was the considered application of overwhelming force to the problem of maintaining order in a system he believed required a particular kind of fear as its structural foundation. He had looked at Westeros and concluded, with the cold accuracy of a man who was rarely wrong about practical matters, that it ran on power and the credible threat of consequence, and he had spent his life being the consequence. The Red Wedding was not aberration, it was policy. The Force also showed Qui-Gon something else. Underneath the architecture, in the place where the wound lived in every person in the Force described to him, Tywin Lannister was afraid, not of Qui-Gon, not of any specific threat, afraid of the dissolution he could feel at the edges of everything he had built, the entropy that waited for every constructed order, the moment when the machinery stopped and the name meant nothing. He had built Lannister's supremacy from a position of adolescent humiliation, a father who had been laughed at, a family whose gold and pride had briefly meant less than a lord's mockery. And he had never stopped building because stopping meant confronting what the building was for. "Sit," Tywin said, in the tone of a man for whom the word was not a courtesy. Qui-Gon sat with the ease of someone for whom the power dynamics of furniture arrangement were not a significant concern. Tywin studied him across the table with those cold green eyes that had assessed kings and commanders and found most of them wanting. "You've been in my city for 6 weeks. You've spoken with my son in his cell, declined Baelish's offer, had 2 conversations with the Red Woman, and been visiting the Stark girl in her chambers every morning through access that should not exist." A pause that was not uncertainty but emphasis. "You have also, according to 3 separate sources, prevented a total of 11 violent incidents in Flea Bottom and the Street of Steel without killing anyone. The Goldcloaks find this baffling. I find it interesting. Violence is rarely the most efficient solution," Qui-Gon said, "even in Westeros. On the contrary," Tywin said, "the Red Wedding suggests it is frequently the most efficient solution. Robb Stark's war cost this realm 3 years of bloodshed. 3 hours at the Twins ended it." He said it without satisfaction, without guilt, with the flat precision of a man presenting a mathematical proof. Sentiment about method is a luxury lords cannot afford. "And the guest right?" Qui-Gon said. The room's temperature did not change. The fire continued its efficient burning. Tywin's expression remained exactly as it had been. "Guest right," Tywin said, "is a tradition. Traditions exist to serve the living. When they cease to serve that function, they become obstacles. 10,000 small folk on the King's Road," Qui-Gon said, with the same quiet precision Tywin used for his mathematical proofs, "are currently without food, shelter, or protection because the armies that passed through their region consumed everything and left nothing. The Red Wedding secured the throne's political position. It did not feed those people. It did not rebuild those villages. It did not address the fact that winter is coming in the literal, structural sense." He felt the Force's emphasis on those words, the weirwood network's ancient cold pressing against his awareness. "And Wason, in a realm at war with itself, will not survive what is coming from the north." Tywin regarded him with the expression of a man encountering an argument he had not previously considered from its specific angle. "The North's threats are exaggerated." "I sat in the Wolfswood and felt what is beyond the wall," Qui-Gon said. "I have been in this world for 6 weeks, and I am telling you, as someone with no political stake in whether you believe me, that the army of the dead is real, and it is coming, and every decision made in this room that prioritizes the Iron Throne over preparing for that threat is a decision that trades a short-term political victory for a long-term extinction." He paused, feeling the Force's endorsement of the directness like a steady hand at his back. "You are the most capable administrator in Westeros. The masters know it, your enemies know it, your children know it. You have spent your life building something that will outlast you. I am telling you that what is coming from the north will unmake everything you have built if you do not turn part of your attention toward it." Tywin was silent for a long moment. In the silence, Qui-Gon felt the Force working in the space between them. Not the dramatic current of a destiny moment, but the quiet possibility of genuine information landing in a mind capable of processing it. Tywin Lannister had been wrong before. He was constitutionally capable of updating his assessment when presented with evidence that met his evidentiary standards. The question was whether a Jedi Master's Force perception constituted evidence by those standards. "What you're describing," Tywin said finally, with the careful precision of a man who had not conceded anything, but was no longer dismissing anything either, would require resources currently committed elsewhere. It would require lords who have been enemies for 3 years to cooperate. It would require the Night's Watch, which is an institution currently composed largely of criminals and castoffs, to be taken seriously by courts that have not taken it seriously in living memory. "Yes," Qui-Gon said, "it would require all of those things. And you believe this is possible. I believe the alternative is worse." Another silence. The fire in the hearth. The maps covering the walls with their notations of armies and supplies and political alliances. The entire machinery of the Game of Thrones laid out in Tywin Lannister's precise hand. "My grandson," Tywin said abruptly, and with a shift in register so slight that only someone reading the Force's description of his emotional landscape would catch its significance. "A movement from the political to something older and more difficult is not fit to rule. I have known this for 2 years. I am managing the consequences of his reign while constructing a path toward stability that does not require his continued participation." Qui-Gon said nothing, recognizing the specific quality of a confession offered without the language of confession. "The realm needs a generation of peace," Tywin continued, "after which the structures I have built will function without requiring my particular involvement." He looked at Qui-Gon with the direct assessment of a man who had decided, with characteristic efficiency, to use the available resource rather than continue analyzing it. "You have abilities and a perspective that I cannot replicate through any other source. I am not asking for loyalty. I am asking for continued access to honest counsel." A pause that cost him something. "The kind my children do not provide, for their own reasons." The Force moved through the room with the complicated quality it used for moments that were neither clean victories nor clean defeats, the gray territory of genuine human transactions, where good and bad were inextricably combined and the best available choice was still deeply imperfect. Tywin Lannister had ordered the Red Wedding, had destroyed the Starks, violated the sacred law of guest right, killed thousands for political advantage, had built his life on the architecture of fear and consequence and the ruthless mathematics of power. And he was not redeemable in any simple sense, and Qui-Gon had no illusion that a conversation had changed the fundamental nature of the man across the table. But he was listening about the North. For the first time in this room, the most powerful man in Westeros was listening about the North. The Force said, "This is what you came for. Not the redemption, the listening." "I'll speak plainly," Qui-Gon said, "always. About the North, about the court, about what I see. In exchange, I want 3 things. Tyrion's trial conducted with genuine fairness rather than predetermined conclusion. Resources directed toward the Night's Watch beyond the token shipments currently allocated. And Sansa Stark treated as a ward rather than a prisoner." Tywin's eyes moved over these requests with the speed of a man calculating costs against returns. "The trial," he said, "I can influence. The Night's Watch resources are a matter of logistics. The Stark girl," a pause, "is a political asset whose value depends on her status." "Her value to you as a political asset," Qui-Gon said, "is significantly higher if she is capable rather than broken. I am making her capable. That serves your interests better than continued isolation." A long silence. Then Tywin Lannister, Lord of Casterly Rock, Hand of the King, the most powerful man in the 7 Kingdoms, gave the smallest possible nod of a man who had decided that the available terms were acceptable without being willing to perform satisfaction about it. Outside the Tower of the Hand, King's Landing continued its ordinary afternoon, entirely unaware that in a chamber above the city's noise, a Jedi Master had traded honesty for the first fragile thread of the North's survival. It was not enough. it was nowhere near enough. The machinery of the Red Wedding's aftermath was still grinding. Cersei's schemes were still in motion, and beyond the wall, the cold was still advancing, with the patience of something that had been waiting for thousands of years. But the Force said, one thread is how nets begin. The weirwood found him at midnight. He was in the God's Wood of the Red Keep, a small neglected space that the Southron court treated as an architectural afterthought. Its heart tree younger and less significant than Winterfell's ancient sentinel, but present enough that the weirwood network's deep current ran through it like a thread connecting this corner of the city to everything north and west and old. He had been coming here for 2 weeks since discovering its existence through the Force's quiet direction toward green-growing things in a city that was mostly stone and ambition. The Godswood's groundskeeper had been alarmed by his first appearance and had stopped being alarmed by his third, with the pragmatic adaptability of someone whose job description had never included theology and was not about to start. Qui-Gon sat with his back against the heart tree's pale bark and felt the network open around him with the quality it used when it had something specific to communicate rather than simply existing in the background of his awareness. In the 6 weeks since his arrival, he had developed something approaching fluency with its particular grammar. Not language, never language, but a vocabulary of images and pressures and emotional registers that translated, imperfectly but sufficiently, into meaning. Tonight the network was showing him the North, not in the visual clarity of a green seer's full sight. He was not that, would never be that, was a guest in this system rather than a native speaker. But in the impressionistic grammar the weirwoods used with him, cold that was not winter's ordinary cold but something beneath it, structural and ancient and advancing, blue light in the darkness beyond a great barrier, a silence that moved, which was the most wrong thing the Force had ever shown him, because silence did not move. Silence was the absence of movement. But this silence had intention and direction, and it was south. The army of the dead was not at the wall yet, but it was closer than it had been 6 weeks ago, and it was moving with the patient inevitability of something that did not require haste, because haste implied the possibility of failure, and this thing did not appear to have modeled failure as an outcome. He sat with this information for a long time, feeling the Force work through his understanding of it with the methodical quality it used for genuinely large problems. He had told Tywin, had planted the seed with the most capable administrator in Westeros, had extracted the first fragile resource commitments toward the Night's Watch, had begun the long work of making the South's governing intelligence take the North's existential threat seriously. It was not enough. He knew it was not enough. The gap between Tywin Lannister intellectually acknowledging a threat and the Seven Kingdoms actually preparing for it was measured in the deaths of kings and the grinding years of political realignment, and the dead did not appear to be planning to wait. The heart tree's bark was cool against his back, and through it the network continued its slow communication, patient as geology. Then something changed. A new quality entered the network's current. Not the vast cold wrongness from beyond the wall, but something closer, warmer, more specific. A point of awareness moving through the weirwood system from the north with the deliberate focus of someone who knew how to navigate it. He felt it reach toward him the way you felt a hand extended in darkness. Purposeful, careful, making itself known without force. Bran. He did not know the name yet. What he felt was a boy, young, damaged in the body but extraordinary in the mind, with a quality of perception through the weirwood network that made Qui-Gon's own sensitivity feel like a candle beside a bonfire. A green seer in the first stages of becoming what he would eventually be, reaching through 10,000 trees with the newborn precision of immense talent, learning its own edges. The contact lasted perhaps 30 seconds. In those 30 seconds, Qui-Gon received, not words, not images, but the compressed emotional grammar of the weirwood's communication. The following understanding. You are seen. You are known. You arrive because something in the network's deep memory recognized what you are. The thing coming from the north is real and old, and has been stopped before, once, at enormous cost, and in a way that has been forgotten by everyone except the trees. The trees remember. Then the contact withdrew, carefully, the way a hand was withdrawn from something hot, not burned, but aware of limits. Qui-Gon opened his eyes. The Godswood's small space held its silence around him. King's Landing's distant noise, a constant background texture. The heart tree's face looked down at him with its carved expression of grief and hunger, red sap catching the moonlight in thin lines down pale bark. He sat with the contact's residue in his awareness, turning it carefully, extracting what could be extracted. The dead had been stopped before. The trees remembered how. He thought about everything the previous 6 weeks had taught him. Tyrion in his cell, furiously intelligent and genuinely wanting to be good in a world that wouldn't allow it. Sansa in her chambers, performing helplessness with a precision that was its own form of extraordinary capability. Learning to read rooms the way the Force had taught him to read them, and doing it faster than most of his Padawans had managed. Ned Stark's honest gray eyes and the particular sorrow in his voice when he had said, "Honest men do not last long in the South." The King's Road's hungry children and the structural machinery that produced them. Melisandre's absolute certainty pointed at the wrong target, genuine spiritual sensitivity in service of a theology that burned children. Littlefinger's wounded intelligence building ladders from other people's suffering. Tywin's cold architectural mind finally fractionally turning toward the north, and underneath all of it, into the Force's consistent presence. Not the force of the Jedi Temple's clean philosophy, not the force of a galaxy he had spent decades navigating, but the Force as it existed here, threaded through weirwood roots and dragon bones in the deep memory of a world that had survived catastrophe before and carried the scar tissue of it in its oldest living things. He had arrived thinking he needed to understand this world. The world had been understanding him. He stood, feeling the cold night air settle around him, and looked up through the Godswood's bare branches at the unfamiliar stars. Somewhere to the north, beyond Winterfell and the Gift and the Wall's ancient magic, something patient and cold was walking south. Somewhere in this city, Sansa Stark was sleeping with the careful stillness of a person who had learned to make themselves small, and in her chest an intelligence that Westeros had never been given any reason to take seriously was waiting for room to grow. Somewhere in his cell, Tyrion Lannister was drinking and knowing things that no one was asking him yet. Somewhere on Dragonstone, a red woman was staring into flames and seeing a future that was almost right in the way that made it more dangerous than being entirely wrong. And somewhere, not yet born into his full power, a boy in the frozen north was learning to see through trees. The Force said, "You are not here to save this world. You are here to help it remember how to save itself." He had spent 6 weeks asking the wrong question. Not what can a Jedi Master do in Westeros, but what does Westeros already contain that needs a Jedi Master to help it find itself? And the answer was not armies or lightsabers or force techniques applied to political problems. The answer was Sansa's intelligence given room, Tyrion's counsel given access, Tywin's capability given direction, Bran's green sight given context, the connections between scattered pieces of a fractured world that did not know it was already holding the tools of its own survival. He was not the weapon. He was the thread. The weirwood's bark behind him pulsed once with a warmth that had no physical source, and in the Godswood's cold air, he felt the Force settle around him with the specific quality it used when something had been decided. Not by him, and not entirely by it, but in the collaborative space between a man's choices and the universe's response to them. Tomorrow he would go back to Tyrion, whose trial was 3 weeks away, and whose survival was not guaranteed by Tywin's fractional influence alone. Tomorrow he would sit with Sansa and teach her what the weirwood contact had shown him about the network's reach. Tomorrow he would write a raven to Winterfell, to the young Lord Bran, who was not there, but whose Maester would forward it north along routes Qui-Gon did not yet know, to wherever the boy had gone, with his strange companions toward the three-eyed crow. Tomorrow there was work. Tonight he stood in the Red Keep's neglected Godswood and felt the force of a world that was not his own, moving through him like cold wind through bare branches, and found in it the particular peace that came not from certainty about outcomes, but from clarity about purpose. The Game of Thrones continued in the towers above him. 5 kings pursued their claims across a bleeding continent. The Lannisters consolidated power over rubble and violation. The phrase sat in a castle that guest right would never again protect. Daenerys Targaryen sat across the narrow sea with 3 dragons and an army and a hunger for justice that had not yet learned the difference between liberation and burning. And in the north the dead walked south, and the trees remembered, and a Jedi Master who had died in one world and been given a second chance in another stood in a neglected godswood and understood, for the first time completely, why the old gods had opened that door. Not because Westeros needed saving, because it needed someone to believe it could save itself, at the exact moment when it had forgotten how. The heart tree wept red sap in the moonlight, and the force was present in it, and the cold stars turned overhead with the indifference of things that outlasted kingdoms. And Qui-Gon Jinn breathed the night air of a world that had become, without his entirely deciding it, something he was willing to stay for. The long night had not yet begun, but dawn, as it always did, would have to be earned. He had work to do. In the weeks that followed, King's Landing would begin to whisper a name it could not place in any lineage or house. A tall man with a blade of impossible light who moved through the city's courts and gutters with equal ease, who had spoken with the hand of the king and sat with the last Stark in the south and walked the wall's shadow in ravens and careful words. Maester Luwin's notes, copied and distributed through the Citadel's cautious network, I described him in the language of scholarly bewilderment. Abilities inconsistent with known magical traditions, philosophical framework incompatible with any established religious order, motivations apparently genuine, which is itself the most suspicious thing about him. Varys filed him in the category of variables too significant to control and too potentially valuable to eliminate. Littlefinger watched from a distance with the expression of a man who had been seen more clearly than he was comfortable with and had not yet decided what to do about it. Sansa Stark in her chambers was no longer simply surviving. She was learning, and beyond the wall the dead marched south through the eternal cold, patient as the end of all things. While in a neglected godswood, a Jedi Master tended the threads of a world's survival, with the quiet dedication of someone who had learned, in the hardest possible school, that the Force's work was rarely dramatic and almost always necessary. The Game of Thrones would continue. Winter would come. The long night would make its demands. And the old gods, in their ancient wisdom, had ensured that when it did, Westeros would not face it entirely alone.